Good afternoon. Welcome to the fourth reading session from AFSAR's project, From Where I Stand. Today Tang, our good friend, will lead this reading, and we will focus on the text by Chinese scholar Sheng Ge. And we kind of set up the situation that we can read together. There are printed texts in front of Tang that we can take. There are two texts. Feel free to take them. There will be enlarged text extract from the text, which prepared by Tang will be showed on the projector. So, From Where I Stand is a long-term project consisted of monthly reading selected texts by our working group member, and also consisted of public program and film such as film screening and workshops. This project built a network of feminist artistic practice and research. It acts on the one hand as a participatory research that through a wide range of topics brought by the working group member contribute to speculate on Asian feminism. On the other hand, this program strives to establish other ways of entering the notion of Asia, which has been mostly led by Western, nationalist-oriented perspectives. This reading session, titled "Reading Sun Ge: How to Understand Asia as Principle," is focused on interview with Chinese scholar Sheng Ge on ArtReview, and a paper by Sun called "How Does Asia Mean?" Now I want to introduce Tang Han. Tang Han is a visual artist whose practice is based on her of cultural relation and critically revolve around the question and phenomenon in everyday life by using diverse artistic mediums, including video, film, installation, and text. Her work has been shown in exhibitions at KW Berlin, Kunsthaus Dresden, OCAB Shenzhen, among others, and her film work has been included in many international film festivals, such as International Festival of Film and Art, Montreal, Taiwan International Documentary Festival, Leipzig, and Image Forum Festival, Tokyo. Now I will hand the mic to Tang Han, and we'll start this session. Thank you.
Hi, everybody. Can you hear me well? Also online. Thank you for Hanwen and Mommy's invitation, and I'm also thank you for everyone's coming and being here. And today we will read together. And because I'm also very happy to have this opportunity to share and also do a close reading today with you about the views from the Chinese scholar Sheng Ge, and who I have always admired. And perhaps some of you already have learned about and also read Sheng Ge before, and this also allows me to make a very short introduction of Sheng Ge. And Sheng Ge born in 1955 in Changchun, China, and she specialized in the history of Japanese political thought, which mainly focused on the epistemological production of post-war Japanese thinking. And she is committed to transforming the epistemological resource of Japanese thought from a cross-cultural perspective. Therefore, her specific study involves fundamental issues for Chinese and Japanese intellectual history. And her research covers questions such as what does Asia mean, why we are looking for Asia, and the formation of Asian discourse and its possibility. This discussion can also serve as inspiration for cultural practitioners, providing guidance on how to search for and develop Asian principles. And that's also why I want to use several together. And today's reading session, I hope it will not be a lecture or presentation. So I'm trying to offer some information. And yeah, because the topic is seriously, maybe during by reading the text a little bit dry. But I still want to encourage everyone to read and discuss it together. So it also helped me to understand some questions I encountered while reading. I have chosen two texts for today's reading. And one is an interview of ArtReview with Sender, and another one is Sender's essay, How Does Asia Mean, which you can find in AFSAR's textbook, and you can also read by your hands out today. Here. And today, we will mainly focus on the Sender's interview with ArtReview in 2015. And it's structured in a Q&A format and highlights some most interesting and relevant questions for us, such as what does Asia mean, and what change has occurred in the meaning of the idea of Asia since the end of the Second World War. How can we understand Asia as principle? Is there such a thing that can be called Asia art? If it's so, what constitutes and the so-called Asianness of this art? How does Asia mean? This essay, first published in 1996, was Sender's first essay with start with Asia discourse. It has been well translated into English and can be found in the book, The Inter-Asian Cultural Study Reader. You can see the image. And due to its length, so in total 57 pages, we are not going to read through this essay together today, but I have selected some passages from it, and it will expand on specific issues and more detailed story reading of the ArtReview interview. I'm not sure if the people online will see the same activity. Yeah, that's the page if I change. How is it going to be? So I want to emphasize that that text we will be reading today are based on Sender's many years of research into a complex issues of thought and reality in East Asia. Please note that while reading Sender with us, it doesn't mean that the context and the story of South Asia, Southeast Asia, or Central Asia and Asia is not important, but it's only Sender's field of work is specifically focused on the East Asian story. I would also like to begin by reading a passage from the introduction of the essay, How Does Asia Mean, in which she described her work. So we can see this. And this paper will inquire into the question of Asia within the historical context of East Asia. I will mainly deal with materials from the intellectual history of modern Japan. This focus is the result of my personal acquaintance with this particular field. And it's also taken because the question of Asia does not assume a similar importance and hence position equally in the intellectual histories in East Asia. In other words, the awareness of Asian question as being problematic was only sensed by those countries situated on the privileged and opposed to in the center, which had undergone both struggles for survival and cultural crisis. Hence, it is not at all a coincidence that we can learn more about the question of Asia from Japanese intellectual history than from China's. And this phase back prompts me to take a different perspective from that Western intellectuals on the question of Asia, a question that deserves greater attention from the intellectuals involved in East and West. And I also believe that research can help us to understand one of the possibilities of the Asian discourse, and in the considering how can it be translated into our own experience and various context or comparison. If you have any other relevant material for today's discussion, please feel free to share to us afterwards. And I will suggest now, and we can start with reading the first two paragraphs in the introductions, the lesson of how does Asia mean? Well, she explained why a discussion of Asia seems necessary. Yeah, who would like to start to read first?
So today, this session is for collective and encourage you all in turn and our reading. The question of Asia, like the question of modernity, resists any attempt to provide a clear explanation, partly because it is loaded with interconnected issues from many facets. Asia is not only a political concept, but also cultural concern. It is not only a geographical location, but also a measure of value judgment. The Asia question itself does not bear any necessary relation to the question of hegemony and counter-hegemony, although the attempts to tackle this question have brought into play considerations of hegemony of the East and the West. The question itself does not entail nationalism, although the theme of nationalism has been conjured in the course of discussing this question. Another reason why the question of Asia is difficult to explicate is that it is hardly a question of substantialization, namely by the way of ascribing to it unequivocal geographical attributes. Quite contrarily, it is often evoked in the discussion of questions that bear no direction relation or are even in stark opposition to any geographical consideration.
And who wants to read the next paragraph?
For a long historical period, Asia has not been treated as self-contained geographical concept, but has only been put forward ideologically in opposition to Europe. The discussion of Asia involved not only the question of Eurocentrism, but also the question of hegemony within the East. As difficult as it is to sort out the question of Asia, it remains an underlying thread running through the intellectual history in the modern world. Hence, we still have to grapple with the question of Asia as one that constitutes a totality in itself. Can you hear people? I'm having a question. Can you hear me well? You can also join the reading. Please raise your hand if you like to join the reading. Or they can raise their hand if they can hear us. Yeah. Can you hear us clearly? Okay, you can raise your hand. Yes, great. Thank you. Thank you very much. Anybody want to read the notes?
The fact that in the history of the academic world, Asia as a singular term has emerged to name collectively a plurality of countries and regions deserves our attention. As Edward Said has pointed out in his book Orientalism, to speak of scholarly specialization as a geographical field is, in the case of Orientalism, fairly revealing, since no one is likely to imagine a field symmetrical to it called Occidentalism. Already the special, perhaps even eccentric attitude of Orientalism becomes apparent, for there is no real analog for taking a fixed, more or less total geographical position towards a wide variety of social, linguistic, political, and historical realities.
However, what Said fails to understand is that there is another side to this problem, that is, for the Asians engaged in the discussion of the favorite question. Though one cannot say there is precisely something called Occidentalism worked out by them, there indeed exists, and not without reason, in abstraction, an ambiguous single entity named the West. Although it is no longer meaningful today to consider the West as a single entity, Occidentalism had, at least in the modern history of East Asia, once played a key role in mediating the self-knowledge of the nations within the East, with important questions being stirred up in the process. Said's study has shown us the political and ideological nature of the object of Orientalism. He has also shown us the Eurocentrism concealed in Orientalism. Thanks to this understanding, we can begin our discussion on a higher level. In view of the recent efforts of the Western intellectuals in deconstructing the myth of colonialism, we do not need to pursue any specialist research before we can accept as common knowledge the question of the right to discourse of the West over the East, implicit in both Orientalism and the Asian history.
At the same time, if we turn our attention to the history of the East, we can also find that this question of Asia is involved in similarly complicated ideological positions. However, in the hands of the Asians, Orientalism becomes different from that which Said criticizes, for it is directed against the Asian Occidentalism. To a large extent, it is not positioned against the Western world from the perspective of the East, but rather against an image of the West constructed in Asia. Therefore, it not only involves the question of reclaiming the right from the West, but importantly, it reveals complicated historical relations within the Asian nations. Thus, the question of Asia must not merely be pursued within the framework defined by the dichotomy of this East versus West, but also should be considered as dealing with internal problems in the Asian region. In turn, the contextual exploration of the Asia question will echo and respond to the Saidian question posed by Western intellectuals.
To here, so anyone want to comment? And if now not, maybe we can continue and start with the interview, because in the interview we have more complex questions. So the first part of the interview is what does Asia mean? So what does Asia mean? Does it possess meaning beyond geographical connotations? And anyone want to read?
Of course, Asia is more than a spiritual concept, which is to say it is more than a geographical concept, and it is also more than a political, historical, geographical concept. In academia, there is no field of political historical geography in which various political, cultural, and historical questions are discussed in the context of where they happen. Asia is indeed a compound concept of politics, history, and geography. But in addition to that, I believe it has an important alternative function, one that is often overlooked. It's spiritual. narrative.
What is Hudo? Hudo refers to the natural geographical characteristics possessed by a given region or geographical space. The combination of these characteristics with the particular spiritual life of people via social activities is called Hudo. Hudo or Hontu is a term used by Japanese philosopher Tetsuro Watsuji. In Hudo, translated in English as climate and culture. The term signifies wind and earth, the natural environment of a given land. So the concept of Asia is at the very least a particular natural geographical space that bears the weight of political, historical, and spiritual culture produced by human activity within it. The various spiritual products, society, and the humanities are discussed within the context of a particular space.
Asia is originally a name that outsiders used for a specific geographical space. Does Asia or the concept of Asia mean something to the people who live within this space? Prior to modern times, Asia did not have any connotations of subjective identification, but in the 20th century that changed. From the Crusades, when the term referred to only to Asia Minor and Anatolia, until the turn of the 20th century, as Europe gradually subjected the world to colonialism, the Asia discourse of the West is consistently one in which Asia served as Europe's other. During the powerful classical period of the Islamic world, this other was a formidable foe. In modern times, this other has become a source of comparison, evidence against the predominance of European culture. Until the end of the Second World War, European ideology did not acknowledge that Asia could also be an equal counterpart with which mutual understanding was possible. Even then, such a relationship was merely a possibility, and to this day, this possibility remains relatively marginal in Europe.
As for Asia, it was not until the end of the Second World War that a relatively widespread trend emerged in which the meaning of Asia was reserved in order to connote a subjectively identified political symbol. At that point, one could no longer say that Asia was merely a concept created by the West. This change in the symbol was marked by the London Conference of 1955, the meeting of the African and Asian states that anticipated the formation of the non-aligned movement of countries. Of course, that was just one phase of its evolution. In terms of major historical trends, the general development of the Asian discourse began in the 20th century, as Asia was transformed into a symbol of self-identification in some societies in the Asian region. Japan was the first place where this self-identification occurred. The growth of Asianism in Japan reached its peak with Japan's victory in the 1945 Japanese-Russian War. The Japanese saw this war as a war between races, the victory of the yellow race over the white race.
In his speech on the three principles of the people, Chinese revolutionary Sun Yat-sen recounted how on his road trip on the Suez Canal, and Arab asked a friend if he was Japanese. At that time, Arabs rarely expressed their sense of solidarity with East Asia, but the Japanese-Russian War had contributed to Arabian identification with Asia as part of the early race. The unfortunate thing is that Japanese Asianism accompanied war, and the methods of war were imitations of European colonial methods. So Japan's path was not one of genuine Asianism. It was a path of Europeanism. This Europeanism was most typically exemplified by the Second World War and Japan's invasion of East and Southeast Asia. Japan's colonialism, along with its methods of advancing the war, was completely in the more early European colonialism.
Therefore, if it can be said that Asianism exists in Asia, then this Asianism has many faces and tension exists between them. But we can say without early judgment that in the late 19th century, a trend emerged in which several different parts of Asia, in many different forms, began to cast off the cultural symbols of the Western other and adopt subjective symbols of self-identification. It was a historical trend, and so the earlier period of history in which Asia was named by the West cannot be used to explain the use of the nomenclature of Asia by Asian people after the turn of the 20th century.
I got earlier when we don't decide we are navigation, sustainable the second grade. And maybe start, yeah, a little bit, and I would like to finish with some another sentence. Yeah, now can you hear me? If the people online also want to join the reading and also can raise hands. And I would like to add something here and simply address materials for the intellectual history of modern Japan in her essay, How Does Asia Mean? And categorize the basic type of Japanese Asian discourse. And here you can see two words. This is developing Asia and reviving Asia. And this is I will summarize the content and what in her essay this is about. So now we go through a little bit to the story. So after the Meiji Resignation, there were two lines of thinking amongst intellectuals in Japan regarding the concept of Asia. One was represented by Fukuzawa Yukichi ideas of dissociating from Asia and integrating with Europe. And the other was represented by Okakura Kinshin, an advocate of Asia is one. The former advocates that Japan should distance itself from the unimaginable enemies in Asia and quickly join the ranks of European and American power. The later emphasized the commonality of Asia's civilizations embodied in the value of love and beauty, which could not be surpassed by European civilization. However, both ideas symbolize Asia. And in the 1930s, Wasuji Tesla provided a new perspective on the question of Asia. Instead of focusing on concept of ideology, he approached it from the everyday reality, thus departing from the symbolic representation of Asia created by Fukuzawa and Okakura. This led to a different line of the thought, an understanding of Asia that should not overlook its geographical and historical attributes, known as Fudo, as we just read before. And now here, and until Yoshimi Takechi's Asianism, single comments. It's a masterpiece and probably the only one of its kind in the intellectual history of post-war Japan. In this particular work, Takechi displays the whole complex configuration of the question of Asia, the relationship between Japan's modernization and expansionism, the relationship between Japanese nationalism and internationalism, and the blind spots between the leftist and rightist approaches to the question of nationalism. It was not until Takuchi's elaborate on the discourse of Asianism since the Meiji period that the question of Asia could be located at the intersection of a complicated system of chains. Later, Tada Umestau, the base point view is that the understanding of Asia as an integrate whole is that of the West. For Asians, Asia is composed of a diverse range of cultures. Through this civilization study from him, there is a possibility to re-examine the question of Asia by taking it as a region rather than an idea. And additionally, Sundar also mentioned the ideas of Asia from the historians associated with the Kyoto School of thought. And it is only in the early 1990s that the new trend of discussion on the question of Asia emerged among intellectuals in Japan, sparked by the publication of several book series called Asia Perspective. This series was published in 1999 and 1994 and had Mikoguchi Yozo as its chief editor. So due to the time limitations, I can only give you a very brief overview of Sundar's historical analysis. But if you are interested in the details, you can also read the full essay. It is a very fascinating story that shows the Orient and Orientalism criticized by Said has produced a different idea of Asia, which has speculated influence Asian intellectuals. For instance, the highlights how Japanese thinker responds to the cultural symbols of the Western order in the Asian discourse, and how Japan is seeking subjectivity in its modernization process by adopting subjectivity symbols for the self-identification. Yeah, and maybe we can just continue and go back to the interview. When one challenges about the meaning of this idea in Asia since the end of the Second World War. After the Second World War, this idea of Asia was used at the Freedom Conference in the context of Operation Africa and Asia in the national independence movements of the two continents. At that point, the core aspect of Asia was the national independence movements at the state level. During the process of Asia's rise during the 1950s, the principal and significance of Asia as a political unit was because of the trade. Other than Japan, the vast majority of Asian regions have experienced either direct or indirect colonization. In this context of being discriminated against in the legal, Asia experienced sharp solidarity in the 1950s. Asia is now like Europe, in that you cannot be roughly integrated on the basis of the single religion. There are at least three major civilizations in Asia, and more than three main religions that cannot be easily integrated. However, the London Conference symbolized a period of integration during the 1950s, in which the conservative Asia was free to vigorously and virtually and entirely
as respect and independence and supervision, so the situation change. Roughly related that happened, I would say it happened as the whole was structured, the entities integrated. Asia began to split out during the 70s because at the time the entire continent was facing a developmental problem, how to achieve modernization. The result was all sorts of dialogue, exchange and cooperation between Asia and the West. Thus, after the 70s, a new round of colonialism began, but this time in an invisible form. After the fall of the Berlin Wall in the early 90s, Asia was faced with the question of forming new alliances. So new coalition, like the Shanghai Federation Organization or the BRICS countries, are in fact symbols of Asia's reorganization of international relations. In these circumstances, we discovered that Asia is incapable of acting in terms of geography as an independent unit in order to emphasize its identity.
For example, the 6 particles in Northeast Asia are major units for Asia. But in the latest scenario, had the participation of 2 North Asian states, Russia and the United States. By means of the Second World War, the United States had already completed its internalization of Asia, and especially in East Asia. These circumstances have led some people to say that Asia has not been established as a reality. From a geographical perspective, Asia was indeed seen unable to master the countless strengths of other regions. The solidarity of the 1950s symbolized by the boundary contrast has indeed been significant.
Now we go together. Now we go together on the second part of the interview. Maybe we can get maybe more information and get more to understand what is Asia as visible. So this, yes. I would like to invite people who is online to join. Anybody want to start?
We can finish the one round.
Yeah.
So the integration of Asia as a geographic space was not achieved. That's right, but if we recall our initial discussion, we said that Asia is more than a geographic concept. It is also an amalgamation of political, historical, and spiritual culture. It symbolizes people's spiritual activities and the field vector of social and artistic activities. In this sense, I believe that today we've reached a stage in which we can reorganize and rephrase the discussion that we need as a space.
Okay, now we have our first turn, and I recommend the people who join online also start to read. Maybe we can start from Jim.
Can you hear me? Can you hear me? Hello?
I can hear you, but not through the speaker, but through my laptop. Let me figure it out. Sorry. Chi, can you speak something?
Yes.
Yes, I can hear you. Thanks. I
Okay.
will share my screen again. Yes, please.
Yeah, you have previously written about the question, how does Asia mean? But it sounds quite new when you mention Asia as a principle. I reached this stage quite recently. In my opinion, the present Asia discourse is still off the mark. If Asia does not have its own principles, then it truly is no more than field material within the framework of Western discourse. To date, that is how Asia has been treated in Western and Chinese scholarship. But I believe that we should now produce Asian principles. However, producing Asian principles is not only for the benefit of Asian people. I think it is a historical responsibility for the benefit of humankind. Asian principles are simply principles that are relative to European, African, and Latin American principles. The discussion of them is not an intellectual activity intended to receive or replace the West.
Now we got one question from Dr. Tang. Maybe you can we can unmute yourself, please.
Thank you so much. 谢谢, domo arigato. I see this is primarily a Japanese and Chinese speaking audience, so I took the liberty. Thank you so much for this event. I chanced upon it through friends of friends. To my knowledge, this is the first such discussion I've attended in Berlin, and that's a great start. So thank you again. And thanks for the references. I wanted to refer to some of the scholars, Count Okakura, for example. You've already mentioned Okakura Tenshin. You've also mentioned Tetsuro. And I see where you're going with this in the sense of a response to Tada Umesa, of course, also, but Tetsuro and Okakura, yeah, Tetsuro. Yeah, so what one needs to understand, and this also perhaps refers to the last, Tetsuro Watsuji and also Yoshimi Takeuchi. So also the Japanese historian and philosopher who came up with the concept of the cultural world of the Chinese characters, the cultural world of the kanji. So what my point would be that this line of thought is neither new, nor is it only connected to Chinese and Japanese nationalism in the 1920s and 30s. And it also predates, it is also not something which came to fore with Bandung. As a scholar of the Cultural Cold War, I'm very interested in how narratives are built in and around colonialism and imperialism throughout the 20th century. Now, the point here is, I think a large part of this discourse is connected to shared histories of colonialism and imperialism. Now, one of your slides talked about Japan being the only exception and not having been colonized. As the Germans would say, Jein, Nein und Ja, in a sense, because if you look at the post-Meiji Restoration Japanese state, its structures and its formats were often very Euro-American. If you look at, in fact, the Kimigayo anthem, the tune of the Kimigayo anthem was also inspired by a lot of Japanese military marching tunes in the Second World War, the First World War, were inspired by German, Prussian tunes. The modernization, Japan's military modernization was done almost entirely through Prussian and French influences. So what I'm trying to say is, although there are feelings in different parts of Asia, that different parts of Asia were colonized differently, and it is true. I don't think India was colonized as brutally as, and also this is what people don't know, not the whole of India was colonized. It was only 40% of India which was geographically under the British. The rest of India was under the Maharajas and the Nawabs, who were subsidiary allies of the British. So the point is, different experiences of colonialism are certainly true, but when we accept that, we forget that as a whole, Asian cultures, Asian societies were and remain deeply mentally colonized. So I think there was a slide which was pointing about European frames of Chinese and Japanese thought. I think there was a slide which said that it is Europeanness which is important. I totally agree with that. For example, if you compare the politics of the People's Republic of China, to what extent is it, does it follow Wenxing Dialong or Chinese classical texts from the first millennium? For example, Wenxing Dialong. To what extent was even Japanese nationalism influenced by Kojiki Den, the text from the 18th century? So I would say a lot of Asian nation state formations are deeply mentally inspired or at least framed in European terms. And this is the success of the Western project. So in order to create Asianness or consolidate Asianness, we have to return to, or at least reinvent, Asian perspectives of looking at the world. I think the major challenge to Asianism or Asian thought in our times is the challenge of rediscovering or discovering, inventing or reinventing intellectual, cognitive, philosophical frames of looking at history, geopolitics, development, nature. For example, Tetsuro Watsuji. One of the reasons he became a little controversial after 1945 in Japan through the American occupation is because Tetsuro looked at how Japanese cosmopolitan, he had this theory of critical cosmopolitanism. So he wanted to say, why should cosmopolitanism only be about people speaking French, German, and Japanese, French, German, and Chinese, French, German, and Hindi? It could be a person who was speaking Japanese, Filipino, Bahasa Indonesia. He also stressed the need for a nature outface. So he said Japanese nationalism, Japanese culture is in this sense unique because it has a dialogue with nature which is very unique. So I think it's time, if we really want to arrive at Asianism, we can't just be sort of, for example, one of the reasons the non-aligned movement succeeded, but also not, is because it was a copy of various Western movements. So anyway, sorry for the long harangue. I just wanted to say that it's very important to return to Asian perspectives of looking at Asia, and not just simply copying Western frameworks of doing Asia. Thank you.
Anybody want to respond?
Thank you, Dr. This your name as very smart. Thank you for that comment. I would like to respond to that. Like I said, I first want to say that I agree with what you said, but based on what we have already read, and I think after we have read a bit more into the text, we will see that a lot of these discussions have already been discussed, so that we can start pursuing it. But I want to say, yes, I also didn't agree with that part that said Japan is like less colonized than others, because I feel like we are way past the time when we could discuss like a not colonized corner of the world. I think we're way beyond that. Everybody is in the same simultaneity. We are in the same time, which is already a very colonized result. Like previously we were not in the same life world, and now we are. We can understand each other based on this, and that is already a sign that nobody is who they once were. And I also thought that the whole argument in both texts actually is very Eurasia-centric. For example, when she said that this change, like how Asia is seen, has changed by the 20th century when more people have been colonized. If we look at colonization as it is like taught here, we know that it started like in the 16th century, right? And you cannot talk about colonialism without talking about the Atlantic. So like without talking about the America and Africa and Europe. And that is something I found was missing in the text that we read, because it is like a very Eurasia focused lineage of thinking about colonialism. And I would know the multiple response, so I will also like raise my question, which can also start the discussion, which is let me remember. I was really interested about Fudo, and I would like to maybe ground the discussion if we're going to go into the discussion phase. I would like to maybe begin by talking about Fudo, because you, Doctor, I'm sorry, I really can't speak.
No worries. If I may just, it's Chakra goes to a bar and drinks tea. Chakra bar tea.
Chakra
You just call me Gautam. That's
Okay.
fine. Just call me Gautam.
Okay, because we also mentioned this thing where it's a critique that to begin to talk about how we relate to each other, we kind of have to go through French, German, English, and all of these European languages for us non-Europeans to understand each other. And I feel like Fudo is one thing that tries to go against that by grounding where we actually are. So if you in Japan and we in the northeast of China are already physically close, maybe that is somewhere where this discussion can begin. Yeah, that's one.
I think
Is it on?
Hello. You can hear me? Yeah, I'm from Macau, so it's Portuguese administrative region until 1999. And I think it is like, I think culture is like habits. I have a cat. I try not to feed him too much fish because it will increase my hosting expenses. I think it is exactly like the values, the simple value that we have, because we are granted freedom of expression since the colonial times, and we need it still today. And what I want to say, maybe to respond to you, I think it's very maybe it would be interesting to deconstruct this myth between the colonizer and the colonized, because Japan itself, the people there, they could not do otherwise as accept the system at same at here. And oh, I forgot one point that is very important for me. Yeah, and also to go to your point, I think it's very important, but maybe also to demystify the West, because when we talk like that, then I would say that, oh, one thing about what Germany before what it was, and what was Poland before it was Christianized, and before France, because just look at France, Italy, Portugal, Spain, they look wonderful, they look super powerful today. But actually, when we look at that, the fact that they speak Latin region languages, it means their original tribes were very weak. But instead, German is a very strong language because they keep their whole language structure. I think maybe I would say, maybe can we try to deconstruct a little bit this relation between the colonized, this dichotomy between the colonizers and the colonized, and the Asia and the West. This may be one question.
Thank you. Since we have a long way to go for reading, let's continue.
I would suggest that maybe some questions will be brought here during our reading to the lesson. Right. Who would like to read next? Shri? Shri, can you read? Thank you.
Can you hear me?
Yeah, I can hear you.
Okay, I will go on. Before we start discussing Asia as principle, I want to ask you, do art or culture play a role of shaping the identity of Asia or the idea of Asia? Art and culture give form to spiritual energy. The spiritual activities of humans must have form before they can present themselves to us. Art utilizes the form of direct observation to communicate this spiritual information. I can say that today, the art I have been exposed to such as the fine arts, theater, and film from East Asia, are westernized in the mainstream, their Asianness is insufficient.
Is there anybody who wants to read from online? Ichi?
Can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you.
Are you saying that the reasoning behind it lacks that awareness of so-called Asian subjectivity and its unconsciously used Western methods or Western perspectives? Yes, it uses Western perspectives. The most typical example is Shan Yi Mao. All of the expressions of Chineseness in his films are intended to cater to the requirements of Hollywood. Of course, there are other ambitious artists who are not as superficial as Zhang Yimou. They are more inclined to seek an Asian element, but these artists, including art curators, have an essentially Western field of vision. For example, one deeply rooted idea in the minds of contemporary artists and curators is modernity. If you do not let them talk about modernity, they basically cannot function. This is a trend that exists today, and I do not believe that it should be negated, because in a certain sense, it expressed the consequences of Western infiltration of all the Asia, from politics and economics to culture. But in fact, there are fringe cultural and artistic activities in which comparatively Asian elements are developing. This development requires nourishment, but I believe that Asian intellectuals seems to have not yet reached its point. It requires a process.
Here, I also have very personal question for myself. Because I complete my bachelor studies in China in the Art Academy, and then continue my study in Germany. But in both countries, I studied Western theories. So I also question to myself that it's most likely that is this, am I? And also unconsciously, like using a Western approach to problems in my art practice, and is that also like deeply rooted in my education? Perhaps we can also question the suitability of the methods used for analyzing and dealing with all problems. Yeah, problems. So I'm also curious how you think about it, and depends on our own experience. Yeah, maybe we can keep going. Who wants to read? Emily?
Hi, can you hear me?
It's okay.
Yeah, so sorry, I'm in a public space, so yeah, but I will try to read as clear as possible. So can you give an example of the cultural activities you mentioned? One example is the Japanese playwright Sakurai Daiso. His Tang theater is extremely Japanese. The performances draw on the lives of ordinary lower-class Japanese people. It is a very special art form. Sakurai is very imaginative, but the number of intellectuals who can appreciate his Tang theater is limited. Yet Sakurai has received acclaim throughout East Asia. Young intellectuals are especially fond of its plays because its methods are very fresh. But the Asian element that it contains must evolve. Another example is the printmaking activities in the Korean city of Gwangju. There are also some artistic activities in Okinawa, such as photography. That area retains its original religion, which resembles shamanism. There is a photographer who photographs a sacrificial ritual that takes place every February in the Miyako Islands, the largest archipelago in Okinawa Prefecture. But this kind of genuinely indigenous artistic or literary activity that does not utilize Western concepts and hermeneutics is today very difficult to circulate and share widely. This is a basic fact, but this wellspring possesses powerful vitality. It will not disappear.
About the algorithm from Sakura Council. And so you'll also notice that Sakura Council's text theater is sampled for cultural activities that incorporate Asian elements. So one of the reasons for this is that when the tent theater is performed in different countries or regions in Asia, the elements are adapted to incorporate local cultural elements into the play. So that means also bring some new things that we create something. And keep going. Perhaps the explanation lies in the mechanisms of acknowledgement and circulation in contemporary art. After all, the people within these mechanisms have no ability to see and understand this kind of art. I think this is a matter that requires a bit more time, and moreover, it is not just a matter for Asian people to resolve. The status and function of the Western intelligentsia, or one could even say, the entire Western world, changes. The Western's intelligentsia's conception of Asia is also changing. I think that ambitious intellectuals, whether they are Asian or Western, will not be satisfied solely with questions of so-called modernity and post-modernity, when the reality of our lives is so diverse and abundant. The day will come when everybody's experience will be fresher and more abundant. In this sense, art and culture can play an extremely important role, but to this point, they have really not done much.
There are some Westerners who believe that the language barrier is the reason that Western people define Asian identity through culture. They can only mechanically imagine other cultures. What do you think of his opinion? I think it is definitely one factor, but it does not tell the whole story. The lack of understanding of Asian in the West is in a certain sense due to the excessive autonomy of the West, which has only just begun to change. When Westerners begin asking this kind of question, it demonstrates that they have begun to recognize the problem. Yet to this day, the majority of Western European and North American intellectuals lack genuine curiosity about Asia, and the reason for this is certainly not the language barrier.
Is it a kind of insularity in their own cultures? That goes together with the historical trends in politics and economics of recent times. The West going forth to conquer the whole world from an advantageous position. Culture cannot be separated from politics and economics, even though they each have their own characteristics. Cultural people in the West with a genuine awareness of Asia are definitely on the fringes. There are very few, but I believe there are some. When I discuss the China question with Western European and North American intellectuals, They first trot out a few frameworks such as modernity, post-modernity, rationality, individual rights, scientism, and evolution. All of these frameworks, in fact, constitute the quite mature cultural structure of modern Europe, and Western intellectuals have been instructed within this cultural system to see them as normal. But the question is, what do they do when they are faced with the East, which does not share these traditions, but only imports parts of these elements from those frameworks? It seems that every Western intellectual I encounter always tries hard to take whatever unfamiliar experience he or she witnesses and hesitantly cram it into these frameworks and use them to interpret it.
When you put it that way, the necessity of Asia as principle becomes apparent. Because to them as well, this is a huge challenge, a very difficult task. Yes, Asia as principle is not an empty phrase. It means that we must define what is universal. We must start from this perspective. Any intellectual or spiritual activity is endemic, that is, governed by feudal. This means that you cannot take your European or North American partial experience to other regions and treat it as global experience shared by all humankind. This kind of approach should be negated right from the start. This is the demand that Asia is, as principle, makes of humanity. At present, if you view Asia from the perspective of European principles, then you will use an allegedly universal imagination to view Asia. So you will search for modernity in Asia and search for scientific rationality. It is not just Europeans who do this. Asian people also do this.
Maybe I just add the definition of the universality. What is the universality? So we mentioned in another essay about it. Universality is a universal value that can cover many particulars, or even all particulars, and that value is called universality. Keep going. That is because in our minds, we have already become random due to our education and academic training. But our lives and our physical and sensory experiences go beyond the mental aspect. Everybody with this kind of educational background has trouble interpreting the change that is occurring in the various Asian societies. For example, how should we interpret the present high degree of mobility, or more specifically, domestic phenomenon of migrant labor in Chinese society? The point is not to give up basis of legitimacy to the existence of every society. This is a kind of intellectual work, so it is not about affirming or negating. What we want to do is to understand. I do not make art, but from the perspective of intellectual history, this issue is extremely pressing. This is what compels us to discuss Asian principles. I think Asian principles, in their most simplified form, are a universalism based on the premise of coexistence of a diverse plurality of physical phenomena. When you say physical phenomenon, is this that Udo who mentioned? Yeah, that's right. Okay, we go to the next. The directives for the visuals.
From your perspective as a scholar, is there such a thing that can be called Asian art? And if so,
What constitutes the so-called Asianness of this art? This is truly a big question. First of all, I think the existence of Asian art is not only possible but necessary. However, the existence of Asian art is definitely a diverse existence. So when we talk about Asian art, the prerequisite is that it does not have representatives. We cannot say that Western art has definite representatives. In fact, it is very easy to name several different schools of Western contemporary art. I believe that Asian art is the same, but there is also a way in which it differs from Western art, in that there is no primariness that encompasses Asian art. It has no unifying characteristic. That's right. Over at least the last 1 or 2 centuries of forceful molding by the West, we have become accustomed when discussing a given field to identify a representative and talk about their primariness. What we should do now is discuss the plurality of a field, but people have not yet formed this habit. This is the prerequisite for discussing Asian art. The reason we need this prerequisite is because Asian art cannot be unified. It is varied and plural. The Chinese philosopher Chen Jiayin has proposed the terminology of the particular, which emphasizes the combination of the individual and the characteristic. I think Asian art comprises countless particulars, but what we want to talk about is not a buffet. If it is a buffet, then Asian art does not exist because it is too dispersed. There are relations between the particulars, and we must use Asian principles to interpret these relations. What is the meaning of these relations? Well, the various particulars are absolutely not the same, and the ways in which they coincide with each other are also not uniform. In establishing these relations between particulars, there is no good and bad. This idea does not comport with European principles. Asian art takes form when we have the goal of establishing relations between the particulars through mutual understanding, through self-liberation, and through the individual's transcendence. This is related to the need for us to change our practice of appreciating Asian art on the basis of European modernity and postmodernity. Our current custom of appreciation is to first translate our culture into English and then use it to enter other cultures.
Are there some aspects of this idea of Asia that contradict or oppose the Western world and its theories? Yes, but I think that point is not so important. Opposing the methods of the West has been necessary thus far. But as soon as you oppose something, you become subject to the limitations of your opposition.
You are answering. Yes, which means that is part of the production of knowledge, that's knowledge, and not particularly destructive. For example, postmodernity is restricted by modernity, so it cannot be free. Asia is restricted by the West and unavoidable historical path. If you want to work towards genuine self-liberation from the state of being restricted by the West, I think criticism is ineffective. You must relativize the West, not negate it. The crucial thing is to build our own framework of understanding on our own organization that includes the effects of the Western interpretation of Asia. Debating and opposing the West is not constructive function. The establishment of Asian thought and culture requires structural construction. And with that, Two relatively familiar methods of distinct intellectuals are those of critiquing the West and informing the West. These two modes are both significant and they are both closely linked to the West itself. But I believe that they are transdisciplinary. They form the foundation on which we must engage in our discussion, and inspired by the West and must be predicated from opposition to the West. We must imagine more freely and build more autonomous.
Is this idea of Asia driven by competition and opposition or by cooperation? A little bit of each. If we're talking about the economy, then it's definitely competition and cooperation, which serves the needs of competition. It's always provisional. Politics is similar, but I think competition and cooperation are difficult terminology to use to understand the realm of culture, and particularly the creation of spiritual products. In fact, I think the creation of spiritual products in Asia is intermediary.
What do you mean by intermediary? I mean that I treat my counterpart as a medium and draw on their work and their spiritual production to fuel my own imagination and creative motivation. Intermediary means that my work is not entirely their work, and their work cannot interpret my work. But if we did not understand each other, then my work would not be the way it is. For example, the spiritual production between China and Japan has to date been imagined in an extremely material form, which is a low-level way of thinking. The truth is that we should take the next step into a field of greater equality. The relationship between China and India should be intermediary or reciprocal, which is neither competition nor cooperation.
This year is the 70th anniversary of the end of the Second World War. Historical factors have created an extremely powerful state of psychological tension between, for example, South Korea and Japan, and China and Japan as well, which have still not dissipated. In art or culture, though, through certain means, dissipate this tension. There are several ways to look at this. Ideally, culture will transcend borders, and in this way, it can dispel the emergent opposition between different societies created by national tension. But in fact, this opposition exists only in the imagination. But the truth is not that simple. When cultural workers do their thinking and creating, this is their mother tongue that determines their identity.
The vast majority of cultural people rarely reflect on this self-identification. The culture is to transcend this tense mentality between nations. Like cultural people must first reflect on the very presupposition of their self-identification and form an identity of themselves that is greater than their national unit. I believe that people who cannot transcend these specific units cannot create truly world-class spiritual products. This is not to say that if you transcend to a national units, then you have no nationality. No, what I want to emphasize is that of one's fixed cultural characteristics, one's mother tongue is serving a fundamental source of one's creative practice. But one need not treat one's nationality as an absolute presupposition. I believe that there are various levels of that in cultural identity. If a cultural identity reaches that of human spirit, it will reflect its human spirit by means of nationality, while resisting an abstract general expression.
I am reminded of certain artists and curators who live abroad. They can freely travel to the most distant parts of the world, but their spirituality seems somewhat lacking. Once a person completely ceases to believe in nationality or their original culture, they may be able to depart a place, but they ultimately never arrive at a new place. Yes, I think that is very accurate. Artists with no roots have no prospects.
So now we go to the last part. Contemporary art as the production platform of the discourse. Due to the time limitation, so I would suggest that we only read the sentence which have been underlined.
This is a very reason for moment because when the campus first complained, I think we could try the only people talking about Asia are politicians. Today, the biggest challenge is that our politicians are still talking about Asia, but Asia is no longer which are presupposition for them. But the people in the world of art and culture, this point of view Asia is a symbolic change that represent the imagination of Asia and the information of these subjectivities, guided by the cultural word in different levels of society. So when the author invited me to talk about Asia, I recognize that contemporary art has already become an important platform for the production of Asian principles. It also symbolized the transition from the politics period of the Britain Conference, where the subject is regional dependence influence at the state level, to a cultural freedom period in which we research for principles. It lies in whether or not you are able to deeply explore the principles of your own culture. And if you are, whether or not you are able to use open, principled, relativized mechanism to transcend yourself. The ability to transcend yourself is one of the most important characteristics of Asianness. When you discuss a local culture, you can take the approach of Asian principles. This culture of yours can possess Asianness, and you can use the approach of Asian principles to address your local issues, which are otherwise mirrored in a particular situation. So I don't think the question of being a particular region is that important. The crucial thing is how you do it.
There are many on the subject of the third world, I would say that there are many blind spots and how states will relates to and acknowledge each other. Each of us have these including creative and culture, and we require an operational solution to overcoming these blind spots. And our peers do that. If we can do that, then we can see and understand the regional situations.
This kind of blind spot is the result of the very Western-centric power structure of all of the societies of Asia are like this. They put themselves at the center and actively respond to the demands of the Chinese culture. To an extent, the situation will be resolved by history. This is not something that we can rely on artists to guide us through or emphasizing certain ideas that is useless. We must pay attention to the limitation of the effectiveness.
And yeah, we already like the performance. We through the whole interview. So I would like to end by a picturing symbol, which is taken from the introduction of the essence of art vision. In the course of thinking about this question, it occurs to me that reflection on Asian questions has brought about a relevant process leading us to confront our own history. In the end, in thinking about the Asian question, we are not lead to being absorbed in the question, what is Asia, but rather to reflect on what sort of issues in fact are set forth in discussion with regard to Asia. In other words, Asia is merely a medium through which we are effectively lead to our history. And it is precisely because this historical significance that it is important we keep asking how does Asia mean? So I hope my sharing has given you a very maybe basically understanding of Sunda's view. And I'm also, yeah, want to thank you everyone for joining the reading session. And I'm really happy to read through the text and also begin and learn together and with you all. And maybe we can now into the discussion. But in the end, I also want to recommend another book of Sundar, which you can also find maybe in some bookshops in Germany. And it's called Universality and Particularities. What is Asianness? Which was published by the Archive Books in 2019. So, I will do you have any comments and also short introduction about this?
Reason for there, because it is a book published as a record of a conversation. A conversation between Sundar and Naoki Sakai, and it was held in 2018 in the In-Between Museum in Beijing. Previous of this conversation, there was also another cooperation between Archive Book and the In-Between Museum, which called China as an Issue, which is more like in-depth writing by Sundar, and that was like Sundar actually in this interview has mentioned about like these topics through the very particular example, for instance, China. And in this book, in the small booklet, actually, Universality and Particularity, what is Asianness, was a conversation, and which they were talking about, like, because both of them are like Sundar is educated, like her majors in political science, focusing on the Japanese post-war thinkers. And Naoki Sakai, he's a professor in the US. So they both have very strong like educational background of Western philosophy. And they were talking about it to enter this conversation about Asianness. They were mostly contemplate Western is their major task is produce theories, but Asia's only produce politics and data. So that's what actually this conversation was revolved about. Yeah, and this is kind of like extensional reading for today's discussion. Yeah, now I would like to open the discussions of people here and also online.
Everybody wants to comment a bit about what we have here.
I don't necessarily have a comment, but I think one line that I was fun to put a bit, and I think it's all right that I just reread it, is when the interviewer, the Asia interviewer, as this note saying, once a person completely ceases to believe in nationality or their regional culture, they may be able to be part of this, but they ultimately never arrive at any place. And for me, someone that line, I can't quite wrap my mind around it, so I'm also curious to see what other people think.
Maybe I have a question because the book, I mean, the essays were written in the 90s, right? So because actually when China, mainland China was in the freest time, it is politically correct, I want to say this. And I have this question because when she asked it about Asia, maybe a question to everyone and to myself too. Is still China today needs this kind of theories? I would like to look at it as a cultural product or academic product, or China actually can stand itself. I mean, I'm not like to talk about it. I just want to. I'm just wondering if she were to produce, if she were to be, how to say, graduated like 30 years later, that we should produce the same thing. What do you think?
I was wondering something similar about the question, and I think that if you from a migrant, it's quite complicated. So maybe instead of adding one question here, that's what it is. Just really complicated.
Thank you. I think your question is a bit difficult maybe for everyone to answer and maybe supports that if she is certain years later, then what I will report to write about. But at least I mean as I read it's I think she is not only like analyzing through the Japanese the story of the thinkers, but also like we can through this story and we can also see and we respond to the concept in I mean not China but also in our region. Yeah. As a comparison.
Yeah, I have a problem, also a question that I wanted to bring up for other people here, not the artist practitioners and so forth, for some combination of both. What she said about Asia being a medium sort of triggered this out, but I was thinking a lot about medium and in particular language and writing. Personally, for me, I don't know if you Tribune Mara, which is the funniest there, she also talks a lot about language being for women of color, a sort of prison in which you are struggling to escape from you know, am I first a woman? Am I first an Asian person? Am I a woman of color? Where do I align my loyalties? How do I compete? How do I escape the prison? Especially the English language providing me with language. How are we not trapped by the effort to transmission, the way we have to use our bodies as bridges in order to transmit something, which raises the question of the relational between the artist and the audience. Like, who is the transmission? What's the relational? What's happening from? Like, where is it emitting from, and who's receiving the transmission, which I think is really important. So I was just also wondering that, we're curious if our artists and practitioners here also struggle with that. That's something personally that I tend to
get trapped in writing in particular. If you also think about syntax and the way that we're taught what good writing is, you know, I grew up in classes to, you know, to say show, don't tell. You know, that we have to strip sentimentality from writing. Well, what kind of gaze is that? What kind of perspective is that here in Towards, you know, the writing of general. I'm sort of curious how people feel to
There's no one else really to talk about the response to that because very directly what do you mean? So in terms of language being a prison, my personal view is that language is always a prison. That's like metaphysically so because we have a world which is very meaningful, but the only way we make sense of the world is through language, which is a limited thing, and it kind of forces you. You can imagine it. If I am a dough, I am being forced through a nut in order to get to the world, and this is of course like almost a violent thing. And then you have different shapes of nuts, like there is the English and the Chinese things. So I think it is always limited in terms of other ways of contact that are available to us. And to bring it back to the text, and what you have said, it is this part in the text where actually Sundar and the interviewer talk about different things. So Sundar was talking about the mother language, and the interviewer was talking about mother country, which for Sundar is very much two different things. She was there was a part where I think she talked about how nationality doesn't matter that much as your mother language, which is in her view the basis of where you understand everything else. So I was curious. Your question is for practicing people, and I'm sorry that I should push your words together, but my question is also for everybody who has this experience of being aware of one's mother language. It doesn't mean, of course, being someone with a migration background makes that very acute, but I think you become aware of your mother language through not just migration, but anytime you realize, oh, other people have other mother languages. I somehow have to use the language as so I wonder what that has meant in terms of how we understand ourselves, our identities, so. And your question about never arriving at a place, and your question from a long time ago about like when she was talking about like this Asian aesthetics and whether we have been conditioned into an Asian aesthetic and we are not actually practicing Asian art without organized.
I think it's a very important question is around languages. I feel now nervous because there's so many people look like me around here talking in English, and my English is very bad. But what I want to say is I love studying languages. I like have a polyglotry relationship with languages, which means the world is fair that you are with a lot of people at the same time. You can't give everyone the same love. I can't express myself, for example, now in English completely as if I wish. And about wisdom, I think maybe it's a pessimistic question, or it's a question of pessimism or optimism, because I have the impression that I was told that we should, I would say, stay out of the box, but I think we are that outside the box. There are still boxes, and I think it depends on our perspective. And about I think it is also about the text. I think before I came, my question was, would we following too much Americanism through the understanding of what is Asia? Because I have the impression that I didn't do any research. I have the impression Germany as a defeated country after war embraces much more American studies or American stuff than, for example, France. And also what we look at the words like Asia or like East in different European languages, we have also different meanings because coming from Macau and I also live in Portugal, then I'm not an Asian in Portugal. I am someone from Macau. But this imaginary of what is Asia is very strong here, especially in Germany, because just look at the word like Orient, when we talk about Orientalism, Orient for Germany is until Middle East, but Orient for the Portuguese is until up to Japan. I think it's very important to maybe, we don't need to learn every language in the world, but maybe it would be nice to imagine how people, how this would be in Chinese. I'm curious to read it in Chinese now, and also how it would be translated in German or French, or in Portuguese or Spanish, because, for example, for the Portuguese, the East until Japan is Orient, but the French say it extreme Orient, because it's, for them already there's some Orient. Maybe I think it is about, again, the question who is reading this and who is talking about this, so that I should talk about. Thank you.
I'm ask him to unmute himself. Yes, Dr. Gautam, please unmute yourself.
Yeah, just call me Gautam. It's Dr. Chakrabarti, but just call me Gautam. The point is, this I wanted to mention this in connection with what the last speaker just said, of classificatory systems which are followed within the academe in the quote-unquote West. Now, you mentioned Extreme Orient. We also know about classifications like the Middle East, the Near East, the Far East, Extreme Orient being Far East. And one of the things that struck me when I first came to Europe was the persistence of these, of this system of classification of academic production, because we are not talking of far-right politicians or populist politicians. We're talking of very prestigious institutions which are located at the heart of Western academia, which also produce a lot of great work. I mean, work we all study and admire. But the fundamental, I believe that one of the challenges to the post-colonial project has been the persistence of institutional classifications that are deeply Orientalistic. Whereas a lot of progress has been done in terms of addressing identities, in terms of addressing how gender roles should be referred to, you know, the pronouns, how the gender star, for example. So on those fronts, there has been a lot of progress, but there sadly hasn't been enough progress, or any progress for that matter, in terms of how we classify knowledge or knowledge production. For example, we see a lot of institutions we may have visited or we are part of persist with names like Near East, Far East, you know, and Middle East. Whereas if we unpack these terms, it's very clear what is happening. It is far from where, near to what, no? Middle in what context? So one of the things that the post-colonial Indian academic structures decided is to call, for example, Middle East West Asia, which is, but people are always surprised when I say that here, because my students are always surprised when I say that here, because West Asia is actually as seen from an Asian perspective, right? So if we were to think in terms of Asia as a continent, then the Middle East and North Africa, the MENA region, everyone talks of the MENA region, but actually it is West Asia. From an Arabophone perspective, if one is thinking from, shall we say, Dubai or Sharjah or Riyadh, then actually, if one is thinking from Cairo, then the Arab world is both East and West Asia, or North Africa and East Asia. So I think it's time to address those of us who are in academia. I think it's important to draw attention to the persistence of this nomenclature in Western academia and question it, because this is clearly a case of geopolitical Orientalism. Thanks.
Thank you. Anybody wants to? Maybe I can respond to Tang's question about making art as an Asian body, that the self-doubt about it, that one educated in the Western education and always have this self-reflection. Am I using the Orientalism in a right one, I would say. I think academia and activism and art can function differently. Of course, it is important to clarify one's own position or clarify the terminology of it. But I do believe art can function differently, and staying in the safe area doesn't really bring the new discourse, especially in my art practice. So rather than giving so much pressure to one's own practice and try to stay in the safe, so-called safe area, I always adopt this as one of my art practice, not regulation, kind of regulation, is there is a word by Nishita Gitario, but also from Kyoto School. He said the fire doesn't burn itself, but the fire is about burning something, but there is another essential of fire, another character of the fire, which is fire doesn't burn itself. But just because fire can't burn itself, it can overcome the burningness of fire. I don't know if it's too much check for you, but if, like for example, when we speak about Orientalism, I believe there is a way to overcome Orientalism through Orientalism in the most Orientalistic practice. And that's what I'm trying in my art practice. Thank you. Is there anybody who wants to add from online or from here?
I forgot that I want to add one part to your question, because sometimes I feel that I'm back in European languages, but I feel sometimes clearer after being, because we studied in the same program as a post-colonial someone. I think I fell in the trap that the Western Academy wanted to form to train non-European people in order to clean the history. This is my social theory, and that's why at some point I felt much more colonized when I speak Cantonese, for example, than English, because English is somehow let's use this strangely clean. But I think again, but after years, I think it's just maybe they are just tools that we use. We can speak back or intentionally back or unvoluntarily back, or we can try to speak it well, and I think it's just really, we can stay in the prison comfortably and something go out something.
Okay. Chakravarti, raise his hand. Please.
Thank you. And that's absolutely correct, the way you said it. Yeah, I'm sorry, I hope I didn't take the time from anyone else who wants to make a point, but just briefly, I wanted to respond to, I just want to throw a theoretical paradigm some of you might already be aware of. So this is the Serbian, the ex-Yugoslavian Serbian sociologist, anthropologist Milica Bakić-Hedin. I can just put a comment in the chat, who has developed this concept in studying the Balkan wars of the 90s called, and the decline and the dissolution of Yugoslavia. The concept is called nesting Orientalisms. So nesting Orientalisms basically looks at how, for example, at the peculiar phenomenon of self-orientalization, and also how each community within Eastern Europe, so her field of study was Eastern Europe, but I think it's applicable to Asian societies too, how a certain society, while reacting to Western Orientalism, and we must remember that Eastern European societies, nowadays this is debated quite a bit because of the current geopolitical scenario, but Eastern Europe has faced a lot of, in this sense, Orientalism from Western Europe, because Balkan societies have historically not been looked upon as being fully European. So, for example, and this is a problem with Russia, Ukraine, and other countries in Central Asia. So, is Russia European? If so, if not, why not? So the answers to these questions are uncomfortably Orientalist, that must be said. The issue is, it's not just about the West being Orientalist vis-a-vis everyone else, but Eastern communities, Eastern societies also perpetuate and push this further between themselves by Orientalizing each other. For example, this is seen in the Second World War in East Asia, in the activities of the Imperial Japanese Army in certain parts of East Asia. This is seen in other contexts also. It's seen in Indian attitudes to certain African communities. It's seen in Chinese attitudes to South Asia and South Asian attitudes to China or Southeast Asia. So it's also important to be aware of our self-orientalization. So what happens is we often use Orientalist paradigms that have, of course, been first established by Western popular and cultural and academic stereotypes, but then we perpetuate them internally. I think we need to think about how, I mean, all of you are East Asian scholars and researchers and students. I'm sure I don't have to mention how in the hiring practices of Chinese and Southeast Asian universities, people from the West are clearly preferred in comparison to people from other parts of the world. So with similar qualifications. So I think these are things we have to also think about. So Orientalism is not just a Western imposition on Asia. It is, but it is also perpetuated within the Eastern mind. This is something, I'll write the thing in the chat. Nesting Orientalism's concept really figures out. Thank you.
Thanks for the comment. If there's no other questions, I would have a very quick question, and I hope this is the right place to us. So as Tang mentioned, artistic practice through the Western lens, like the fear of doing that. As a European person who's been trying to learn more about Chinese and Chinese culture for a long time now, what I often ask myself and what I'm afraid in a sense is that sometimes my interest, like how Asian people or Chinese people see my interest, like can it be seen as genuine interest or as the active time that a European person tries to appropriate something that is not theirs. And yeah, that's it, because I feel like what I'm trying to do is like to learn and put myself on the same level for communication rather than trying to evolve. But it's hard for me to understand how
the Asian or China can see what I'm doing. I don't know if it makes sense.
I think that we all make mistake. We start from the mistake. Yeah, either start from Occidentalism or Orientalism and try to overcome. Thanks for your comment. Okay, if there is no other questions, thank you. I don't know if we have like a time limit and that's why we're talking about that. Or...
Yeah, time is up. Yeah.
Okay, then I will just try to distribute I once more want to pack a lot of stuff into books or into one comment, but I am reminded by your question of another part of the text where she tries to quote a Chinese philosopher Zhang who talked about universality and particularity, and I read one speech in which he talked about this, where he said to think about universality and different specificities, we have to think about it not in terms of up and down, like up to universality and down to particularity, but rather on the same horizontal level. So from my particularity to your particularity. And then what we are doing is any kind of translation. So by finding something that I understand and that you somehow also understand, and then we can get it out comprehension of that. So that I think is a very helpful tool for me, like as a Chinese person living with a German person, I somehow find myself always like, oh, you're so German, like, which is also kind of problematic. That's what I'm trying to do now, or think about it now. And I mean, maybe that's helpful.
Thank you. So now we end of this meeting session, and thanks everyone to join. Thank you.